now. From something, you probably don't know what. That's the point. Defense mechanisms are the automatic, mostly unconscious strategies your brain uses to shield you from thoughts and feelings that feel too painful, too threatening, or too complicated to deal with directly. They were first mapped by Sigmund Freud and later expanded by his daughter Anna. And in the 100 years since, psychology has confirmed one thing above everything else. Every person on Earth runs them. Every single one. They're not signs that something is wrong with you. They're signs that something was once too much. Your brain built a wall between you and that feeling, and it's been maintaining that wall ever since, long after the original threat has passed. That's what makes them complicated. They worked. Once, they worked. The problem is, the brain never got the memo that it was safe to stop. Here are all 14 defense mechanisms. Explained. Denial. Denial is a defense mechanism where the brain flat out refuses to accept a reality that feels too painful or threatening to face. It's the most recognizable one on this list. You see it everywhere in American life. The person who gets a serious medical diagnosis and keeps saying the doctor must have made a mistake. The couple whose marriage is clearly over and neither one will say it. The drinker who insists they could stop whenever they want. When a painful truth arrives, the brain has two options: accept it and deal with everything that comes with that, or block it before it fully registers. Denial is the second option. The onset is a strange numbness. Something happens, someone says something, a test comes back, and instead of feeling what you'd expect, there's a flatness. A quiet certainty that this can't be right. That's the onset. At the peak, the denial is airtight. Evidence doesn't move you. Other people's concern bounces off. You feel calm, maybe even certain, while everyone around you is alarmed. That's the peak. The aftermath is exhausting. Keeping reality at arm's length takes constant energy. Small moments of knowing break through. The gap between what you sense and what you're willing to accept gets harder and harder to maintain. The pattern with denial is that problems don't pause while you're not looking at them. They grow. The health issue gets more serious. The relationship deteriorates further. The financial situation deepens. You meet it later, but you meet it worse. Over time, denial doesn't protect you from the problem. It just makes sure you deal with it after you've run out of time to fix it. Denial doesn't make the truth go away. It just makes sure it hits you harder when it finally does. Repression. Repression is a defense mechanism where the mind buries an anxiety-producing memory, feeling, or thought so deep that you can no longer consciously access it. You don't choose to forget. It happens automatically. The memory is still there. You just can't find it. It shows up most around trauma, shame, and experiences that conflicted with how you see yourself. The person who draws a complete blank on a period of childhood they describe as fine. The adult who can't recall the worst moments of a difficult year, but feels anxious in certain places without knowing why. When something arrives that the mind judges as too threatening, it routes that material away before full awareness. The onset is invisible. You don't experience the suppression. You just experience the absence. Something's not there that maybe should be. At the peak, the repressed material is completely out of reach. But the emotional charge attached to it isn't. It stays active underground, shaping your behavior without explanation. You react strongly to things that shouldn't carry that weight. You feel a specific dread you can't name. That's the peak. The aftermath shows up in what therapists call the return of the repressed. Certain smells, certain songs, a look on someone's face. The feeling comes back even when the memory doesn't. The longer repression holds, the more energy the brain spends maintaining it. It leaks into sleep, into relationships, into a body that holds what the mind has refused. Repression doesn't erase the past. It just makes your past run your present from somewhere you can't see it. Projection. Projection is a defense mechanism where a feeling you can't accept in yourself gets relocated to someone else. You don't feel the jealousy, they do. You're not the selfish one, they are. You're not being dishonest, they definitely are. The feeling is real. You've just given it a different address. It's all over American workplaces and relationships. The manager who calls the team unmotivated while avoiding their own responsibilities. The partner who accuses the other of wanting out when they're the one who checked out months ago. The person who insists you're angry when they're the one who raised their voice. When a feeling conflicts with how you see yourself, the brain looks for an exit. Projection is that exit. The onset feels like perception, like you're simply noticing something that's genuinely there in the other person. At the peak, the projected feeling seems completely external to you. You're convinced the other person is the jealous one, the dishonest one, the one with the problem. You treat them accordingly. The confrontation, the withdrawal, the judgment, it all feels justified. That's the peak. The aftermath is circular conflict. The person being projected onto has no idea what they're actually being accused of. Arguments go nowhere because the real subject never gets named. The longer you rely on projection, the less access you have to the parts of yourself that actually need attention. Every quality you can't tolerate in yourself finds a home in the people around you. Projection doesn't get rid of what you can't accept about yourself. It just makes you fight it in everyone else instead. Rationalization. Rationalization is a defense mechanism where the brain builds a logical-sounding explanation after the fact to justify something that was actually driven by something far less flattering. The reasoning comes second. The act or feeling came first. The explanation is reverse-engineered to make it acceptable. It's in the person who snaps at their kid and decides the kid needed a lesson anyway. In the employee who takes credit for a colleague's idea and quietly concludes they contributed enough to deserve it. In anyone who has ever said, "I was just being honest," when what they were being was mean. When your behavior conflicts with your self-image, the brain moves fast. It finds a reason. The onset feels like clarity, like you've suddenly understood the situation better than you did a second ago. That's the onset. At the peak, the rationalization is convincing. Not just to other people, to you. You genuinely believe the story. The original feeling that drove the action has been successfully buried under the explanation. That's the peak. The aftermath is that the cover story becomes the official record, even inside your own mind. You lose track of what actually motivated you. The pattern in people who rationalize heavily is that accountability becomes nearly impossible. There's always a reason. Every failure has an explanation that places the cause somewhere else. Rationalization doesn't change what you did. It just makes sure you never have to understand why you actually did it. Displacement. Displacement is a defense mechanism where an emotion aimed at one target gets redirected toward a safer one. The anger at your boss lands on your spouse. The anxiety about your health turns into irritability at your kids. The humiliation from a Monday morning meeting becomes road rage on the highway home. The feeling is completely real. The target is completely wrong. It's one of the most common mechanisms in everyday American life. The person who slams the cabinet door after a phone call with their mother didn't decide to do that. The brain rerouted automatically. The real target felt too risky or too overwhelming to receive the emotion directly. When a feeling arises towards something dangerous or inaccessible, the brain finds somewhere safer for it to go. The onset isn't felt as redirection. It feels like the emotion landing exactly where it belongs. Something about the safe target annoys you. You respond. At the peak, the emotion hits the safe target at full volume. The reaction is completely disproportionate to whatever triggered it in that moment. Your partner says something small, and you respond like they said something devastating. That's the peak. The aftermath is guilt you can't quite explain. The pressure has been released, but the original source was never touched. Over time, displacement damages the relationships closest to you because those are the ones absorbing emotions they had nothing to do with. Displacement doesn't resolve what made you angry, it just distributes the damage to people who didn't cause it. Sublimation. Sublimation is the one defense mechanism on this list that regularly produces something the world calls impressive. It's the brain taking an unacceptable impulse, usually something aggressive, sexual, or anxiety-driven, and redirecting it into something socially valued. The rage becomes a startup. The obsession becomes a novel. The grief becomes a charity that helps thousands of people. It's the college athlete who channels aggression into a state championship. The person who lost someone and threw themselves into volunteer work for 3 years. The driven professional who was an angry kid and now runs a department. When an impulse arises that the self judges as unacceptable, sublimation reroutes it towards something constructive. The onset feels like motivation, like drive arriving from nowhere, like you suddenly know exactly what you need to do. That's the onset. At the peak, the activity genuinely absorbs the impulse. You're working, creating, building. The feeling is still present, but transformed into something that looks like ambition. That's the peak, and it produces real results. The aftermath is where sublimation gets complicated. The output is real. The grief is still there when the project is finished. The anger is still there when the gym closes. The outlet provides relief. It doesn't provide resolution. The pattern in people who rely heavily on sublimation is relentless productivity that functions as a way to never sit still long enough to feel anything. Sublimation turns pain into output. The problem is the pain is still there, waiting for the work to stop. Regression. Regression is a defense mechanism where, under enough stress, a person reverts to emotional behaviors and coping patterns from an earlier stage of their life. The 40-year-old throws a tantrum. The composed professional sulks like a teenager. The person who handles boardroom conflict without blinking completely falls apart in their marriage. The adult tools run out, and the brain goes back to what it learned first. It shows up when current coping capacity gets overwhelmed. When stress exceeds what the mature nervous system can hold, the brain defaults to older software. A version of you that knew how to get needs met, even if those methods were 7 years old. The onset is visible to everyone in the room. Your voice shifts, your language simplifies. You might cry when you normally wouldn't, cling, withdraw, or dig in with a stubbornness that doesn't match who you are the rest of the time. That's the onset. At the peak, you're not accessing your adult reasoning. You're operating from a much older emotional place. Logic doesn't land. Perspective isn't available. That's the peak. The aftermath is usually embarrassment. The stress passes, and you look back at your behavior with genuine confusion. Why did I say that? Because, for a few minutes, you weren't quite the adult version of yourself. The same triggers tend to pull the same person back to the same age, usually the age the original wound formed. Regression doesn't protect you from the stress, it just makes you face it with the tools you had before you had better ones. Reaction formation. Reaction formation is a defense mechanism where you take an unacceptable feeling and replace it with its exact opposite. Then amplify that opposite until it becomes your defining position. You're terrified of something, so you become the loudest voice dismissing it. You resent someone, so you become conspicuously devoted to them. The feeling that can't be expressed gets buried under the performance of its mirror image. You've seen this. The person who talks constantly about how happy their marriage is. The loudest anti-drug voice in the room who has a private habit. The politician who campaigns aggressively against something they privately engage in. The opposite feeling isn't fake. That's what makes reaction formation so effective. The brain replaces the original impulse thoroughly enough that the replacement becomes genuinely felt. When an impulse arises that the ego finds unacceptable, reaction formation substitutes the opposite and turns up the volume. The onset feels like conviction, like a strong, clear stance on something. That's the onset. At the peak, the performance is complete. You believe the opposite feeling. The original impulse has been papered over so thoroughly that the paper has become the wall. That's the peak. The aftermath is exhaustion. Performing the opposite of what you actually feel is genuinely draining. The exaggeration tends to increase over time as the buried feeling pushes harder. Long-term, reaction formation locks you into performing the inverse of who you actually are. Reaction formation doesn't remove the feeling you can't accept. It just makes you spend your life loudly being its opposite. Dissociation. Dissociation is a defense mechanism where the mind disconnects from feelings, surroundings, or even from the sense of being yourself when the emotional content of a moment becomes too much to stay present for. You go somewhere else. Not physically, but you're not fully there anymore. The experience continues. You're watching it from a slight distance. It runs on a spectrum. Everyone's experienced the mild version, driving home and not remembering half the route, sitting through a meeting and retaining almost nothing. At the more intense end, dissociation can involve feeling like the world isn't real, feeling like you're not real, or having significant gaps in memory. The mechanism is the same across the spectrum. The brain detects something it can't process and steps back from full presence. The onset is a feeling of unreality. The room looks slightly unfamiliar. Sounds come from a little further away than they should. Your own hands look strange to you. Time does something unusual. That's the onset. At the peak, the disconnection is enough to get through whatever is happening. The hard conversation occurs. The painful moment passes. But you weren't fully there for it. That's the peak. The aftermath is patchy memory and a delayed emotional response. The feeling you should have had arrives hours or days later, untethered from what caused it. Long-term, heavy dissociation means you're physically present for your life and emotionally absent from most of it. Dissociation doesn't make the unbearable things bearable, it just makes sure you weren't fully there when they happened. Intellectualization. Intellectualization is a defense mechanism where you process an emotionally loaded situation through pure analysis, keeping the feeling at a safe clinical distance so it can never fully land. You don't feel the grief. You research the stages of grief. You don't feel the fear about the diagnosis. You spend 2 weeks deep in medical literature. You don't feel the hurt from the relationship. You build a calm, articulate case about attachment theory. It's extremely common in educated professional American culture. Being the composed one in a crisis reads as strength. And intellectualization genuinely produces that composure. The problem is that understanding something and experiencing something are not the same thing. When a threatening feeling arises, the brain reroutes it into the cognitive system. The onset is a sudden and genuine curiosity about the situation. You want to understand it, research it, map it. That's the onset. At the peak, the intellectual engagement is real and often impressive. You understand the situation in depth. You just understand it the way you'd understand a documentary about someone else's life. The information is there. The experience isn't. That's the peak. The aftermath is delayed emotion. You handle the crisis with extraordinary calm. Then you find yourself crying in a parking lot 6 months later and not knowing why. Long-term, intellectualization produces people who are articulate about their inner life, but disconnected from it. They can describe their pain with precision. They just haven't felt it yet. Intellectualization doesn't protect you from the feeling. It just makes you the last person in the room to know it's there. Suppression. Suppression is the one defense mechanism on this list that can actually be healthy. It's the conscious, deliberate decision to set a feeling aside and deal with it later. Not to deny it exists, not to bury it permanently, just to put it down for right now because this isn't the moment. It shows up in people who operate under pressure. The surgeon who sets aside personal anxiety to finish the procedure. The parent who holds it together through the school drop-off and saves the breakdown for after bedtime. The soldier who processes in the quiet moments, not in the field. The crucial difference from repression is awareness. Suppression knows what it's doing. Repression doesn't. The onset is a conscious acknowledgement. You notice the feeling. You recognize it's there. You decide it goes on hold. That's the onset. At the peak, suppression works. You're functional. You're present. The feeling is filed, not erased. That's the peak, and when done properly, this is a genuinely adaptive skill. The aftermath is where it goes wrong. Suppression is a short-term tool that requires follow-through. The implicit deal is that you come back to the feeling later. Most people don't. The later never comes. The feeling stays filed. The pattern in people who suppress without follow-through is a slow accumulation of unfelt things that eventually find another way out. Suppression is healthy when later actually arrives. Most of the time, you just keep moving and never go back for it. Compartmentalization. Compartmentalization is a defense mechanism where the brain separates conflicting values, behaviors, or versions of yourself into sealed boxes that are never allowed to touch. The person who is genuinely warm at home and systematically ruthless at work. The deeply religious person who prays every morning and cuts ethical corners every afternoon. The loving parent with a secret they've never disclosed to anyone in their family. Each version is real, they just never meet. This isn't conscious hypocrisy. The boxes are sealed tight enough that when you're in one, the other genuinely doesn't exist for you. The brain keeps incompatible realities from ever occupying the same space. The onset is the crossing of a threshold. You walk into the office and the home version of you goes offline. You walk out and the work version recedes. Each context activates its own self. The transition feels seamless. That's the onset. At the peak, compartmentalization is remarkably effective. You can operate cleanly in very different environments because you're not carrying the weight of your contradictions into each one. High performers use it constantly. That's the peak. The aftermath is the cost of sealed boxes. Genuine intimacy requires integration. To be fully known by someone means letting all the boxes open at once. For people who live in compartments, that level of exposure feels genuinely dangerous. Long-term, compartmentalization produces a life that functions well in every separate context and feels coherent in none. Compartmentalization keeps your contradictions from meeting each other. The price is that you never become a person who doesn't have them. Splitting. Splitting is a defense mechanism where the brain removes its ability to hold complexity about a person or situation and forces everything into one of two categories: completely good or completely bad. No middle ground, no nuance, no gray. The person who was perfect yesterday is suddenly, completely, a villain today. And your brain has quietly rewritten the history to match. You felt this in smaller ways. The breakup where someone who was a soulmate becomes someone you can't believe you ever loved. The job that felt like a calling until the moment it didn't. The political team that's entirely right, and the other one that's entirely wrong. The brain, under enough stress or attachment pressure, simplifies. When the mind can't tolerate ambivalence, holding both the good and bad of the same person simultaneously, splitting resolves that discomfort by eliminating one side. The onset is a flip. Fast. Clean. Someone who was all good becomes all bad. Or the reverse. It arrives as clarity. That's the onset. At the peak, the split is complete. The person is a saint or a monster. The situation is a gift or a disaster. The discomfort of complexity is gone because the brain removed the mechanism that creates it. That's the peak. The aftermath is relational chaos. The people around you never know which version of the assessment they're going to get. They can't trust that the all-good phase is stable because they've seen the flip happen before. Long-term, splitting makes it impossible to sustain honest, lasting relationships. Everyone eventually disappoints. And for a brain that splits, disappointment doesn't produce complexity, it produces reversal. Splitting doesn't simplify the world, it just removes your ability to see it as it actually is. Passive aggression. Passive aggression is a defense mechanism where anger or resentment that can't be expressed directly gets communicated through behavior instead of words. The task that gets done wrong. The help that somehow makes things worse. The agreement that never quite results in action. The compliment that lands slightly too sharp. The anger is completely real. The expression of it is completely disguised. It's one of the most socially tolerated forms of hostility in American culture because it maintains plausible deniability. You can't be accused of being angry. You didn't say anything. You were just late. You forgot. You tried. It didn't work out. Sorry about that. When anger or resentment arises toward a person or situation where direct expression feels unsafe or unacceptable, the brain finds an indirect route. The onset is a surface agreement that covers an internal refusal. You say yes. You mean something else entirely. That's the onset. At the peak, the passive aggression is deliberate, even when it doesn't feel that way. The delay is slightly too long. The mistake is slightly too convenient. The sigh is slightly too audible. Each individual act is deniable on its own. The pattern is not. That's the peak. The aftermath is that the person on the receiving end is affected by something they can never directly name or address. Every time they try to bring it up, there's nothing to point to. The conflict stays permanently unresolved because the anger was never actually spoken. Long-term, passive aggression traps both people in a relationship that can never be honest. The resentment behind every underhanded behavior accumulates until the relationship collapses under the weight of everything that was never said. Passive aggression doesn't avoid conflict. It just makes sure the conflict never has a chance to end. 14 mechanisms. 14 different ways your brain decided, at some point, that the feeling was too much and built something to keep it away. And here's what connects every single one of them. Not one is a character flaw. Not one is evidence that something is fundamentally broken in you. Every mechanism on this list was built for a reason. Denial got you through the initial shock. Repression let you function when you couldn't afford to fall apart. Displacement gave the feeling somewhere to go when the real target was too dangerous. They worked. At the time, they genuinely worked. The problem is that the brain doesn't automatically retire them when the threat is gone. The wall that protected a 9-year-old from something unsurvivable is still running in the adult who now has the resources and the support to actually face it. The defense that got you through a crisis keeps firing in situations that aren't crises anymore. It's doing its job, it just doesn't know the job description changed. The goal isn't to dismantle your defenses. You can't, and you wouldn't want to. The goal is to notice them. Because the moment you can see the wall, you have a choice about whether to walk through it. Your brain built these to protect you. The question worth asking is whether you still need the protection, or whether the protection itself has become the thing that's holding you back.